The morning mist clung to the Argonne forest like a shroud of death, and Captain William Henderson knew that by nightfall, many of his men would never see another dawn. It was September 26, 1918, and the greatest American military operation in history was about to begin. Henderson crouched in the muddy trench, his weathered hands gripping a worn map of the German defensive positions. Round him, over 1 million American soldiers of the First Army prepared for what General John Joseph Pershing had called the decisive blow of the war. The Meuse-Argonne sector stretched 47 miles across northeastern France, a landscape scarred by 4 years of brutal warfare, and fortified by the Germans into what they believed was an impregnable fortress. The German positions were formidable beyond imagination. The Hindenburg Line, anchored by the fortress city of Sedan, commanded the vital railway junction that supplied the entire German Western Front. 3 defensive lines stretched across the region, the first along the Meuse River, the second through the dense Argonne forest, and the third, the Kriemhild Stelling, considered the strongest defensive position on the Western Front. As Henderson studied the terrain, he thought of the intelligence reports that had crossed his desk. The German Fourth Army, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had spent years turning every hill, every grove, every stream into a killing field. Machine gun nests were carved into solid rock, artillery positions were concealed in reinforced concrete bunkers, and the forest itself had been transformed into a maze of barbed wire and death traps. The weight of history pressed upon every American shoulder that morning. This offensive would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the emergence of America as a world power. President Woodrow Wilson had staked his 14-point peace plan on American military success, and General Pershing had fought fiercely to maintain American independence from French and British command. According to historical accounts documented in the National Archives, the scale of preparation was unprecedented. Nearly 3,000 artillery pieces had been moved into position under cover of darkness. The American Expeditionary Forces had transported over 600,000 tons of supplies through the narrow French railways, a logistical miracle that strained every resource. Henderson's regiment, part of the 79th Division, had been assigned to assault the heavily fortified village of Montfaucon, a key German observation post that commanded the entire sector. The village sat atop a hill 300 feet above the surrounding countryside, its ancient abbey converted into a fortress bristling with machine guns and artillery spotters. The captain checked his pocket watch, 0530 hours in exactly 25 minutes. The largest artillery barrage in American military history would begin. 2,700 guns would unleash hell upon the German positions for precisely 4 hours, after which the infantry would advance across no man's land into the teeth of whatever remained of the German defenses. Round him, soldiers made their final preparations. Some wrote letters home, others cleaned their rifles one last time, and a few simply stared into the gray dawn sky, lost in private thoughts of home and family. These were the men who would carry the American flag deeper into enemy territory than any force in the nation's history. The offensive would ultimately cost over 26,000 American lives and wound 95,000 more. But it would also break the back of German resistance and force the armistice that would end the Great War. As Henderson folded his map and prepared to give the order that would send his men over the top, he could not have known that he was about to participate in the battle that would define America's role in the 20th century. The earth trembled as if struck by the fist of God himself. At 0500 hours on September 26, 1918, the American artillery opened with a roar that shattered windows 30 miles away. Captain Henderson pressed his face against the muddy wall of the trench as shells screamed overhead, like avenging angels, their terrible song drowning out all human sound. For relentless hours, American gunners poured destruction upon the German lines. High explosive shells cratered the landscape, shrapnel rounds swept away barbed wire entanglements, and gas shells poisoned the very air the Germans breathed. The bombardment was so intense that seismographs in Switzerland recorded the tremors, and the flash of exploding shells could be seen from the cathedral towers of Reims. 20 miles distant. At 0530 hours, the barrage lifted with surgical precision, and across a front stretching from the Meuse River to the western edge of the Argonne forest, over 600,000 American soldiers rose from their trenches and advanced into the smoky hell of no man's land. Henderson's whistle pierced the sudden relative quiet as he led his company over the parapet, his boots finding purchase in the churned mud that had once been peaceful French farmland. The initial advance met with surprising success. The German first line, pulverized by the artillery barrage, offered only scattered resistance. American soldiers moved forward in well-rehearsed formations, capturing objectives that had been marked in red on their maps for weeks. The village of Vauquois fell within 2 hours, its defenders stunned into surrender by the ferocity of the bombardment. But as the Americans pressed deeper into German territory, the true nature of their enemy's defenses became horrifyingly clear. The Germans had learned hard lessons from 4 years of war, and they had prepared multiple defensive lines, each more formidable than the last. When the first line fell, the defenders simply withdrew to prepared positions and resumed their deadly work. The terrain itself became an enemy. The Argonne forest, which had once provided romantic settings for French poetry, now concealed machine gun nests behind every fallen log, and snipers' roosts in every surviving tree. The forest floor, carpeted with 4 years of decomposing leaves and the bones of earlier battles, sucked at the soldiers' boots and concealed deadly wire entanglements and minefields. As documented in military historian Edward Lengel's comprehensive study of the offensive, the German machine gunners proved particularly deadly. These veteran soldiers, many of whom had survived the battles of Verdun and the Somme, knew exactly how to position their weapons for maximum killing efficiency. They allowed American troops to advance within 50 yards before opening fire, creating killing fields where entire companies were mowed down in minutes. Henderson's regiment reached the outskirts of Montfaucon by midday, but the ancient village proved to be a fortress that defied all attempts at capture. German machine gunners, positioned in the stone cellars of destroyed houses, commanded every approach. Artillery observers in the abbey's tower called down precise fire upon any American movement, turning the surrounding countryside into a moonscape of craters and corpses. The American advance, which had begun with such promise, began to bog down in the face of determined German resistance and the logistical nightmare of moving supplies. Across the cratered battlefield, the narrow roads, already damaged by years of war, collapsed entirely under the weight of American trucks and artillery pieces. Wounded soldiers lay in the mud for hours waiting for evacuation, while ammunition supplies dwindled dangerously low. By nightfall on the first day, American forces had advanced between 2 and 6 miles along different sectors of the front, capturing several key villages but falling short of their primary objectives. The cost had been tremendous, over 4,000 casualties in a single day, with entire companies reduced to handfuls of survivors. As Henderson established his command post in a shell-torn farmhouse, he could hear the wounded crying in the darkness beyond the American lines. The great offensive that was supposed to end the war had begun, but already it was clear that the Germans would not yield their positions without exacting a terrible price in American blood. Dawn of September 27th brought no relief from the nightmare that had engulfed the American First Army. Captain Henderson surveyed the battlefield through his field glasses, watching as German artillery methodically targeted every moving figure across the scarred landscape. The second day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had begun with the sobering realization that the German resistance was far stronger than anyone had anticipated. The morning attack resumed with grim determination. Henderson's company, now reduced to 67 men from its original strength of 150, advanced through the ruins of what had once been a prosperous farming village. Every building had been reduced to rubble, every tree stripped of leaves and branches by 4 years of shellfire. The very soil seemed poisoned, churned into a gray paste of mud, metal fragments, and human remains. The German defensive strategy revealed its terrible efficiency as the Americans pressed forward. Rather than holding static positions, German commanders employed a defense in depth that drew American forces into carefully prepared Killing zones. Machine gun teams would fire a few bursts to slow the American advance, then withdraw to secondary positions while hidden artillery observers called down devastating barrages on the exposed attackers. The village of Montfaucon, perched on its commanding hill, remained the key to the entire sector. Its medieval walls, reinforced with steel and concrete, bristled with machine guns that commanded every approach. German snipers, concealed in the ruins of the ancient abbey, picked off American officers with methodical precision. Each attempt to assault the position resulted in dozens of casualties and no territorial gain. Private Robert Sullivan, one of Henderson's most reliable soldiers, had been among the first to reach the base of Montfaucon Hill. Through a runner's message, he reported that the German defenses were unlike anything they had encountered in training. Steel-reinforced concrete bunkers were invisible until attackers were within deadly range. Underground tunnels allowed German soldiers to appear behind American positions, creating chaos and confusion in the attacking ranks. The logistics of the offensive began to collapse under the strain of combat and difficult terrain. The few roads capable of handling heavy traffic were constantly under German artillery fire. Supply wagons, stuck in the mud or destroyed by shell fire, created massive traffic jams that stretched back for miles. Ammunition ran critically low in forward positions, forcing American soldiers to scavenge German weapons and supplies from abandoned positions. Field hospitals, overwhelmed by the flood of casualties, established aid stations in every available building behind the American lines. According to medical records preserved in the Army Medical Museum, field surgeons worked without rest, performing life-saving operations by candlelight in ruined churches and abandoned barns. The wounded, when they could be evacuated at all, faced agonizing journeys over roads cratered by artillery and clogged with military traffic. The human cost of the offensive mounted with each passing hour. Entire regiments that had marched confidently into battle just 2 days earlier were reduced to scattered groups of survivors. Company commanders found themselves leading squads, and sergeants commanded what had once been platoons. The 79th Division alone suffered over 3,000 casualties in the first 3 days of fighting. Yet despite the horrific losses, American determination remained unbroken. Henderson observed something remarkable in his surviving soldiers, a grim resilience that seemed to grow stronger with each German counterattack. These men, many of whom had never seen combat before arriving in France, were learning the hard lessons of modern warfare and adapting with surprising speed. The German High Command, monitoring the battle from their headquarters in Spa, Belgium, began to express concern about American fighting spirit. German intelligence reports, later captured by Allied forces, noted that American soldiers showed unusual tenacity in the face of heavy casualties. Unlike other Allied forces, who had learned to conserve their strength for limited objectives, the Americans seemed willing to accept enormous losses to achieve their goals. As the third day of the offensive drew to a close, Henderson received orders that would define the remainder of the battle. General Pershing, facing criticism from French Marshal Verdun and Foch about the slow American advance, had decided to commit additional divisions to the assault. The offensive that had begun as a coordinated attack was becoming a battle of attrition that would test the limits of American endurance. October 1st, 1918, marked the 6th day of an offensive that had transformed from a swift advance into a grinding battle of attrition. Captain Henderson, his uniform caked with mud and his face gaunt from sleepless nights, stood among the ruins of what had once been the village church of Montfaucon. After 5 days of continuous assault, American forces had finally captured the strategic hilltop, but the cost had been devastating. The battle for Montfaucon had become a symbol of American determination and German desperation. For 72 hours, soldiers of the 79th Division had hurled themselves against the fortress-like village in waves that resembled the futile charges of earlier war years. Each attack was met with withering machine gun fire from concealed positions, accurate artillery strikes, and counterattacks by German stormtroopers who seemed to materialize from the ruins themselves. The breakthrough had come not through heroic charge, but through methodical reduction of German strongpoints. American engineers, working under constant fire, had tunneled beneath German machine gun nests and destroyed them with explosive charges. Artillery observers, positioned in shell holes within 50 yards of German positions, had called down pinpoint barrages that finally silenced the defenders. Henderson surveyed the carnage around the captured village with a mixture of pride and horror. The cost of taking Montfaucon had been over 1,500 casualties from his division alone. Entire companies had been reduced to squads, and some battalions existed only on paper. The medieval abbey that had dominated the battlefield for centuries was now a pile of rubble that barely rose above the surrounding ruins. The capture of Montfaucon opened the second phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but it also revealed the true scale of German defensive preparations. Intelligence gathered from captured documents showed that the Germans had prepared no fewer than 7 defensive lines across the sector, each designed to channel American attacks into predetermined killing zones. The weather, which had remained relatively mild during the first week of October, began to deteriorate as autumn storms swept across northeastern France. Rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire that bogged down American advances and made the evacuation of wounded nearly impossible. Soldiers fought in conditions that resembled the worst days of Verdun, wading through mud that reached their knees while carrying equipment that seemed to grow heavier. With each step, supply problems reached crisis proportions as the American advance stretched transportation networks beyond their breaking point. The narrow-gauge railway that connected American rear areas to the front lines could barely handle normal traffic, much less the massive requirements of an army in sustained combat. Critical shortages developed in artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and even basic rations. As documented in General Pershing's personal memoirs, published by the Army War College, the strain of the offensive began to tell on American leadership as well as enlisted men. Division commanders, many of whom had never directed large-scale combat operations, struggled to coordinate attacks across difficult terrain while maintaining communication with increasingly scattered units. The fog of war became literal as well as figurative, with morning mists and smoke from countless fires reducing visibility to mere yards. The German response to American pressure evolved throughout the battle, demonstrating the adaptability that had kept their armies effective despite 4 years of warfare. Rather than attempting to hold every position, German commanders began implementing strategic withdrawals that drew American forces into carefully prepared ambushes. Fresh divisions, transferred from quieter sectors of the Western Front, brought new energy to the German defense. Private Sullivan, now acting as Henderson's runner after his sergeant had been wounded, brought reports from other sectors of the offensive that painted a picture of mixed success and continued heavy casualties. The 4th Division had advanced 6 miles in the Meuse River sector, but had been stopped cold by German artillery positioned on the heights of the river's eastern bank. The 28th Division, fighting in the dense Argonne forest, had become scattered into company-sized units that were fighting isolated battles against German strongpoints. The human drama of the offensive played out in countless individual acts of courage and sacrifice. Medal of Honor recipients like Sergeant Alvin York became legends, but they represented thousands of anonymous soldiers who performed extraordinary acts of bravery. Under impossible conditions, American medical personnel, working without regard for their own safety, established aid stations within range of German artillery to treat wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated to rear areas. As Henderson prepared his company for another day of combat, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred in both himself and his men. The enthusiastic volunteers who had sailed from New York Harbor 6 months earlier had been replaced by hardened veterans who understood the true cost of modern warfare. They had learned to live with constant danger, to function despite exhaustion, and to maintain unit cohesion even as familiar faces disappeared from their ranks. With alarming regularity, October 14, 1918, brought the kind of crisp autumn morning that would have been perfect for hunting in the Pennsylvania forests, where many of Henderson's soldiers had grown up. Instead, they prepared for what General Pershing had designated as the climactic phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, After nearly 3 weeks of grinding combat, American forces stood poised to assault the Kriemhilde Stelling, the most formidable defensive position on the Western Front. The German defensive line stretched across a landscape that seemed designed by nature for military defense. Hills commanded every valley, forests concealed machine gun nests and artillery positions, and rivers created natural obstacles that channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The Germans had spent 2 years improving upon nature's advantages, creating a defensive system that their own high command considered impregnable. Henderson's company, reinforced with replacements who looked impossibly young compared to the battle-hardened veterans they served alongside, occupied positions in a shell-torn forest overlooking the German lines. Through his field glasses, the captain could see the concrete bunkers and steel observation towers that marked the main German defensive belt. Every position was carefully sighted to provide interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any breakthrough at one point could be contained by fire from adjacent positions. The American preparations for the assault revealed how much the Army had learned during 3 weeks of combat. Artillery barrages were now precisely coordinated with infantry advances, using techniques that had been perfected through bitter experience. Supply lines, which had collapsed during the offensive's first week, had been rebuilt and reinforced to handle the massive requirements of sustained combat. The assault began at dawn with an artillery barrage that surpassed even the opening bombardment of September 26th. American gunners, now experienced in the techniques of modern warfare, concentrated their fire on specific German strong points rather than delivering area bombardments that warned defenders of impending attacks. Counter-battery fire systematically targeted German artillery positions, reducing the devastating defensive fires that had characterized earlier phases of the battle. When American infantry advanced at 0700 hours, they moved with the tactical sophistication that 3 weeks of combat had taught them. Instead of advancing in waves that presented perfect targets for German machine gunners, soldiers moved in small groups that used terrain features for concealment and mutual support. Squad leaders, many of whom had been promoted from the ranks to replace officer casualties, demonstrated leadership skills that would have been remarkable in peacetime armies. The breakthrough, when it came, occurred not through heroic charge, but through the methodical reduction of German defensive positions. American engineers, working under intense fire, cleared paths through wire entanglements and mine fields. Infantry squads, supported by precise artillery fire, systematically eliminated machine gun nests and observation posts that had dominated the battlefield for weeks. According to military records preserved in the National Archives, the key moment came when elements of the 2nd Division, advancing through a gap created by the destruction of a German strongpoint, reached the main German defensive line before defenders could organize effective resistance. Once American soldiers established positions within the Kriemhilde Stelling, the entire defensive system began to unravel as German commanders lost the ability to coordinate their defensive fires. The collapse of German resistance, when it began, occurred with surprising speed. Positions that had withstood weeks of assault were abandoned as German units, cut off from their command structure and running low on ammunition, began withdrawing toward prepared positions closer to the German border. The retreat, initially conducted in good order, began to accelerate as American pressure increased and German supply lines came under increasing attack. Henderson's company advanced further in a single day than they had moved during the entire first week of the offensive. Villages that had been distant objectives marked on maps suddenly appeared before advancing American soldiers, many of them abandoned by defenders who had withdrawn during the night. The landscape, scarred by weeks of artillery fire, began to show signs of normal life as American forces moved beyond the zone of active combat. The human cost of the breakthrough remained severe, but American casualties began to decrease as German resistance weakened. Field hospitals, overwhelmed during the first weeks of the offensive, reported decreasing numbers of wounded soldiers arriving for treatment. The grim mathematics of attrition warfare, which had favored defenders during the battle's early phases, began to shift in favor of the advancing Americans. Private Sullivan, now promoted to corporal after demonstrating exceptional leadership during several combat actions, brought Henderson reports from other sectors that confirmed the systematic collapse of German defensive positions. The French Fourth Army, advancing along the American left flank, had broken through German lines and was pursuing retreating defenders toward the Belgian border. As American forces prepared to exploit their breakthrough, news arrived that would transform the entire strategic situation. Revolution had broken out in Germany, and the German government was seeking an armistice to end the war. The offensive that had begun as an attempt to break the deadlock of trench warfare was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations, hastening the end of the Great War itself. November 1st, 1918, found Captain Henderson's company advancing through the liberated French countryside at a pace that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. The breakthrough of the Kriemhilde Stellung had transformed the Meuse-Argonne offensive from a grinding battle of attrition into a pursuit that carried American forces deeper into German-held territory with each passing day. The landscape through which American soldiers advanced told the story of 4 years of occupation and warfare. Villages that had once housed prosperous farming communities stood empty, their inhabitants evacuated years earlier when the front lines had stabilized. Churches, schools, and homes showed the systematic destruction that retreating German forces had inflicted. As they withdrew toward their homeland, Henderson's veterans, now seasoned by weeks of combat, moved with the confident efficiency of professional soldiers, the replacements, who had joined the company during the offensive's middle phases, had been quickly integrated into squad-level units that functioned with remarkable coordination. These men had learned the hard lessons of modern warfare and had developed the tactical skills necessary to exploit German weaknesses while minimizing their own casualties. The German retreat, initially conducted in good order, was beginning to show signs of disorganization as American pressure intensified. Abandoned equipment littered the roads leading toward the German border, and prisoners taken during the advance reported declining morale among German units that had been ordered to conduct delaying actions against pursuing American forces. Intelligence reports reaching American commanders painted a picture of systematic collapse within the German military structure. Entire divisions were reporting that they could no longer maintain effective resistance, and German railway networks were breaking down under the strain of moving troops and supplies. While under constant attack from American aircraft and long-range artillery, the impact of the American advance extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the State Department archives, German peace overtures to President Wilson had intensified. As American forces approached the pre-war German border, the prospect of American troops fighting on German soil created political pressures within Germany that military commanders could no longer ignore. Henderson's company participated in the liberation of Sedan on November 6, 1918, capturing the fortress city that had commanded the vital railway junction supplying the German Western Front. The fall of Sedan, which German commanders had considered essential to maintaining their defensive positions, marked the effective end of organized German resistance in the Meuse-Argonne sector. The human drama of liberation played out in countless individual encounters between American soldiers and French civilians who had lived under German occupation for over 4 years. Children who had grown up knowing only war emerged from cellars and hiding places to witness the arrival of foreign soldiers who spoke of freedom and peace. Elderly residents who remembered the German invasion of 1914 wept openly as American flags replaced German military banners on public buildings. The logistics of the advancing American army presented challenges that were almost as complex as those faced during the static warfare of the offensive's early phases. Supply lines that had struggled to support stationary forces now had to maintain armies that were advancing 20 miles per day across terrain that had been systematically destroyed by retreating German forces. Medical personnel who had established elaborate aid station networks during the battle's static phases found themselves constantly relocating to keep pace with advancing combat units. The nature of casualties changed as well, with fewer soldiers wounded by artillery and machine gun fire, but increasing numbers suffering from exhaustion, exposure, and diseases that flourished in the unsanitary conditions of rapid military movement. The approaching end of the war created its own psychological challenges for soldiers who had survived weeks of intense combat. Veterans like Private Sullivan, now wearing sergeant's stripes earned through demonstrated leadership under fire, found it difficult to believe that the nightmare of warfare might finally be ending. The prospect of peace seemed almost as surreal as the war itself had once appeared to young men who had grown up in peaceful American communities. American aircraft, operating from hastily constructed airfields, reported increasing evidence of German military collapse throughout the region. Roads leading toward Germany were clogged with retreating military units, mixed with civilian refugees fleeing the advancing Allied armies. German ammunition dumps and supply depots were being systematically destroyed by their own forces to prevent capture. As Henderson prepared his company for what everyone hoped would be the final advance toward the German border, he reflected on the transformation that 6 weeks of combat had produced in both himself and his soldiers. The enthusiastic volunteers who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean 6 months earlier had been replaced by hardened veterans who understood both the terrible cost of warfare and the value of the peace they were fighting to achieve. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had cost American forces over 26,000 killed and 95,000 wounded, but it had also demonstrated American military capability on a scale that established the United States as a dominant world power. The lessons learned in the forests and hills of northeastern France would influence American military doctrine for generations. The morning of November 11th, 1918, dawned gray and cold across the scarred battlefields of northeastern France. Captain Henderson stood with his surviving soldiers in a quiet forest clearing, listening to the sound that had been absent from their lives for 47 days. Complete silence. At precisely 11 o'clock, the guns that had thundered continuously since September 26th fell silent, marking the end of the Great War and the beginning of peace. The armistice had been signed in Marshal Ferdinand and Fox railway car in the forest of Compiègne at 5 o'clock that morning, but news of the ceasefire had taken hours to reach frontline units scattered across the Western Front. Henderson had received the order to cease all offensive operations at 10:30, giving him just 30 minutes to ensure that his soldiers understood that the war was truly over. The final weeks of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had carried American forces to the very gates of Germany itself. Henderson's company had advanced over 60 miles from their starting positions in the Argonne forest, participating in the liberation of dozens of French villages and towns that had endured for years of German occupation. The cost had been enormous, but the strategic objectives that General Pershing had established in September had been achieved beyond his most optimistic expectations. Sergeant Sullivan, his uniform bearing the marks of 7 weeks of continuous combat, stood quietly beside his captain as both men struggled to comprehend that their ordeal was finally over. Around them, soldiers who had learned to live with constant danger found themselves uncertain how to behave in a world where enemy artillery no longer threatened every movement and machine gun bullets no longer whistled overhead. The human cost of the offensive could be measured in the faces of Henderson's surviving soldiers. Of the 150 men who had gone over the top on September 26th, only 63 remained to witness the armistice. The others lay buried in hastily dug graves scattered across the battlefields of France, or in organized military cemeteries that would become permanent monuments to American sacrifice. Yet the strategic impact of the Meuse-Argonne offensive extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. American forces had demonstrated that the United States possessed the industrial capacity, military organization, and national will necessary to project decisive power across the Atlantic Ocean. The offensive had broken the deadlock of trench warfare and hastened the end of a conflict that had consumed an entire generation of European youth. The broader implications of American military success were already becoming apparent in the diplomatic negotiations that would shape the post-war world. President Wilson's 14 points which had seemed idealistic when first proposed, now carried the weight of American military victory. The United States had earned the right to participate as an equal partner in determining the terms of peace and the structure of international relations. According to official records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive remains the largest military operation in United States history. Over 1.2 million American soldiers participated in the campaign, supported by the largest concentration of artillery, aircraft, and support personnel that the nation had ever assembled. For a single operation, the lessons learned during the offensive would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The integration of artillery, infantry, and air power that had been perfected through bitter experience would become the foundation of American combined arms tactics. The leadership skills demonstrated by officers and non-commissioned officers who had been promoted from the ranks would establish new standards for military professionalism. Henderson spent the afternoon of November 11th walking through the positions his company had occupied during the final weeks of the offensive. The landscape, scarred by shells and torn by the passage of armies, already showed signs of nature's recovery. French farmers, returning to lands that had been battlefields just days earlier, were beginning the long process of restoring agricultural productivity to soil that had been poisoned by 4 years of warfare. The captain paused at a crude wooden cross that marked the grave of Private James Morrison, a 19-year-old volunteer from Ohio who had been killed during the assault on the Kriemhild Stelling. Morrison had enlisted on his 18th birthday, sailed to France with dreams of adventure, and died 3 weeks before his 20th birthday in a shell hole outside a village, whose name he had never learned to pronounce. As Henderson prepared to lead his surviving soldiers back to rear areas, where they would begin the long process of demobilization and return to civilian life, he reflected on the transformation that the Meuse-Argonne Offensive had produced in American society. The nation that had entered the war as a regional power had emerged as a global superpower, with responsibilities and opportunities that would define the remainder of the 20th century. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive had indeed paved the way for peace, but it had also established the United States as the dominant military and economic power in a world that would face new challenges and conflicts in the decades ahead. The young men who had survived the fierce fight in the forests of France would return home as veterans who understood both the terrible cost of warfare and the precious value of the peace they had helped to secure.